Money is often said to be the root of all evil, and if you think about it, it's not hard to see why. Just consider how many crimes have been committed in the name of wealth or greed. It really speaks volumes. Money has a way of blinding people, even driving wedges between loved ones, turning family members against each other. Today, we will dive into a case that illustrates just how far greed can go. This is the tragic story of Antonio P. Antonio, a man who was murdered for his wealth by someone he trusted most, his own family. Hello everyone, welcome back to Darkasiawithmegan, where we dive into the darkest corners of crime. Today's story is sponsored by Aura, and trust me, the timing couldn't be more fitting. Well, I heard on the news that hackers have potentially stolen the social security numbers of every single American. I know, that's crazy, right? Recently, over 2.9 billion records were taken from National Public Data, which offers personal details to employers, investigators, and others. So we're talking full names, addresses, dates of birth, phone numbers, and yes, social security numbers. And now these hackers are giving this info away for free online. As someone who explores true crime stories for a living, this hits close to home. The idea that criminals can access and exploit personal data so easily is terrifying. But here's the good news. There is a way to protect yourself, and that's with Aura. Aura is not just a typical monitoring service. They're scanning billions of data points, everything from the dark web to public records, and if they spot any suspicious activity, you're notified in real time. Plus, Aura doesn't just detect problems, they help you fix them. If something goes wrong, Aura steps in with up to $5 million in identity theft insurance, which is huge. A lot of other services just tell you after the damage is done, but Aura helps you take action before things get out of control. Head over to aura.com/darkasia for a 14-day free trial and let Aura show you what they can do. Stay safe out there, both online and in real life. Thanks for watching, and now let's get into today's case. Antonio Pabalan Antonio, or APA, was born around 1950 in Caloocan City, a bustling part of Metro Manila, Philippines. Growing up in a humble household, Antonio's father was a policeman, and his mother sold food at the local market. While they didn't have much, they had enough to live a simple, content life. At 17, Antonio married Lourdes Bermejo, who was 5 years his senior. The couple had 3 sons together, Nelson, Aldrin, and Carl. Throughout his life, he married several other women, resulting in a large and complex family tree. With 5 families and 11 children in total, Antonio's life may have been complicated, but his children recall him as a loving father and a dedicated leader who cared for them all equally. As a young man, Antonio P. Antonio started working as a laborer at Magnolia Ice Cream, a branch of the well-known San Miguel Corporation. But he wasn't just an ordinary worker. He had a strong sense of justice and soon helped organize the workers' labor union. When the martial law was declared, Antonio joined the underground resistance movement, fighting for the rights of the working class. His activism landed him in prison twice, arrested for what was labeled rebellion and subversive activities. After his release, though, Antonio made a choice. He wanted something more, something different. He was ready to live a normal life, but not just any life. He dreamed of success, not only for himself, but for his entire family. Antonio was a man with big ambitions and a clear vision for the future. His children remember him often saying, "I won't let my children or grandchildren ever go poor." And he meant it. He launched his first business in the 1980s, sending workers to Saudi Arabia and Japan. This venture, which would later be known as Fortune International, took off and became incredibly successful, particularly in the 1990s and early 2000s. But Antonio wasn't one to rest on his laurels. He dove into other industries, including general construction, call centers, furniture businesses, and even hotel and resort management. Antonio became a well-respected figure in the community, even serving 3 terms as the president of BF Homes Parañaque, a village of 60,000 homeowners. People looked up to him, not just because of his wealth and status, but because of the aura of authority he carried. He wasn't violent, but his presence alone commanded respect. Beneath that tough exterior, though, was a family man who loved to mentor his children and grandchildren, teaching them about life and success. Despite loving all his children equally, Antonio did show a special kind of attention to his eldest son, Nelson Bermejo Antonio. In many Asian cultures, the eldest son is often viewed as the heir, the one who bears the weight of family responsibility and inheritance. Nelson was no exception. Antonio gave him key roles in his business and planned to leave him a larger share of the inheritance, essentially handing Nelson not just a silver platter, but a gold one. But Nelson didn't live up to his father's expectations. Instead of following in his father's footsteps and using the opportunities handed to him to reach new heights, Nelson refused to finish his education, even dropping out of college. This became a major source of disappointment for Antonio. The tension between father and son grew, often leading to heated arguments, and sometimes even physical altercations. It's possible that over time, this harsh treatment caused Nelson to harbor deep resentment toward his father, setting the stage for the tragic events that would later unfold. Nelson's relationship with his father was already strained, but it reached a breaking point when he took things to a whole new level. After being appointed as the president of Antonio's company, Nelson began living a lavish lifestyle, indulging in expensive habits. Both he and his wife, Nessie, developed a gambling addiction, losing millions of pesos at the casino. Desperate to fund his habit, Nelson started embezzling money from the company, effectively siphoning off funds for his own use, a corruption scandal within the family business. The betrayal weighed heavily on Antonio, causing him immense stress and even leading to health problems as he grappled with the mess his once promising son had made. But it didn't stop there. Nelson and his wife began stealing valuable items and money from the family home, worsening the already tense situation. At first, no one could figure out who was responsible for the missing money, which only added to the friction between siblings. But when it became clear that Nelson and Nessie were behind the thefts, the family was at a loss for how to handle the situation. Threats were made, with some siblings warning Nelson that they would eventually expose him and his wife. This only fueled his anger, and he lashed out, even declaring that when the time came for the inheritance to be divided, none of them would get a single peso from him. It's hard to say exactly when, but at some point, Nelson began to unravel. His siblings suspected he might be suffering from some sort of mental illness, and some even wondered if outside influences were pushing him further down a dark path. Given his gambling addiction, kleptomania, and general laziness when it came to working, Nelson may have realized that his father was on the verge of disowning him. Driven by fear, resentment, and anxiety over losing his place as the family's heir, Nelson's desperation seemed to know no bounds. He may have feared Antonio would change the will, cutting him out entirely, and this drove him to take drastic and dangerous actions. On September 9th, 2013, things took a deadly turn. Armed men forced their way into the Villa Antonio residence, clearly with the help of someone on the inside. These men made their way to Antonio's room, forcing the security guard to knock on the door at gunpoint. At the time, Antonio was inside, watching the CCTV footage of the events unfolding just outside. As soon as he saw the masked intruders, he realized they were there to kill him. Antonio was no stranger to danger, and he had prepared for such a moment. In his room, he kept a machine gun and a shotgun. As the gunmen approached, Antonio armed himself, determined to defend his life. He fired his machine gun, but it jammed after the first shot. Undeterred, he switched to his shotgun. Eyewitnesses heard him shout that if he had to die, he would take one of the gunmen down with him. His defiance was enough to scare the hitmen, who fled the scene in a getaway car. Though Antonio survived that day, the police have yet to track down the attackers or uncover who orchestrated the plot. That night, after the assassination attempt, the atmosphere at the Antonio household was tense and filled with fear. Antonio was clearly shaken, and at 2 a.m., he made a frantic call to his children, instructing them to hide his grandchildren, fearing for their safety. Someone had just tried to kill him, and he was terrified that his family might be next. When the family gathered to review the CCTV footage, they were alarmed at just how easily the armed men had navigated through the house, even disabling key CCTV cameras along the way. Suspicion grew when they questioned the guard, who mentioned that one of the gunmen seemed familiar. He was the same height and build as Nelson. Although they weren't certain, the possibility that Nelson might have been behind the attack started to creep into their minds. It was a heavy accusation to make, but the clues were unsettling. Even though Antonio might have suspected that Nelson was behind the assassination attempt, he chose to cover for his son, telling the others that a rival was behind it all. Perhaps, despite everything, Antonio still wanted to protect his eldest son. But Nelson, sensing that the truth was coming to light, likely feared that his father would soon erase him from the will for good. Desperation drove him, and he was determined to act before any legal changes could be made. Sadly, that first attempt on Antonio's life wasn't the end of it. Just 2 days later, on the morning of September 11th, Nelson showed up at the family home. The guard on duty noticed something odd under Nelson's shirt, something that looked suspiciously like a gun. Antonio had originally planned to leave for Makati that day, but for some reason he returned home. That decision would haunt his family forever, because it gave Nelson the chance to carry out his final deadly plan. Witnesses described Nelson pacing back and forth outside Antonio's office before finally entering. Antonio, sensing danger, tried to flee the room, but Nelson had a gun pointed directly at him. From just 2 meters away, Nelson pulled the trigger and shot his father in the back. Antonio collapsed, but Nelson wasn't done. He approached his father's fallen body and shot him again at close range, ensuring there was no chance of survival. In a horrifying act of finality, Nelson even executed a coup de grace, delivering a final shot to his father as he held him by the head. Since his death, the journey toward justice has been fraught with obstacles. The suspect, Antonio's son, was moved, released, and eventually fled, causing years of delays. After the brutal murder, Nelson surrendered to the Parañaque City PNP substation 08. However, a jurisdictional issue complicated things. Antonio's house was located on the boundary between 2 cities, and due to a territorial dispute, Nelson was released before Las Piñas City PNP could take proper action. The family was devastated, believing that corruption within the police force had played a role in Nelson's release. For years, Nelson disappeared, fleeing to Dubai to escape justice. The family was left scrambling, desperate for some form of resolution. Finally, in 2018, a stroke of luck came when a Filipino in Abu Dhabi recognized Nelson and alerted the family. With the combined efforts of the FBI, Interpol, and the Philippine National Police, Nelson was arrested in Dubai in February 2018. He was brought back to Manila under heavy security. During the investigation, which was mostly conducted in private, Nelson confessed to spending 200,000 pesos to fund the September 9, 2013 failed assassination attempt. While his guilt wasn't shocking to the family, the confirmation of it still sent waves of grief and heartbreak through them. Finally, justice has been served. On March 20th, 2024, the Parañaque City Regional Trial Court found Nelson Antonio guilty of parricide, convicting him for the murder of his father, businessman Antonio P. Antonio. After more than a decade, Nelson was sentenced to reclusion perpetua, or life imprisonment, which in the Philippines typically lasts around 40 years, as the country no longer has the death penalty. However, even as Nelson was led away to serve his sentence, he expressed no remorse whatsoever for killing his father. The lack of guilt from the very person who caused so much pain adds another layer of tragedy to the already heartbreaking case. As questions still linger about whether Nelson had any accomplices, suspicion has fallen onto Antonio's first wife, Lourdes. Despite being estranged from Antonio for more than a decade, Lourdes quickly asserted her status as the legal wife right after the funeral, raising suspicions that she was primarily interested in securing as much of Antonio's fortune as possible. Many in the family believe her sudden involvement was motivated by the desire to claim a large portion of the estate. But despite the potential for more legal battles, Antonio's children have made the decision to step back from pursuing their father's wealth. For them, the importance of peace and harmony within the family outweighs any financial gain. The loss of their father was already a tremendous blow. They have no desire to go through further conflict over money. On each anniversary, loved ones meet at the Antonio Mausoleum in Everest Hills Memorial Park in Muntinlupa City to honor his memory. Let's hope that all parties involved can move forward and finally find peace. That is all for today. Thanks for watching.